right, everybody. Welcome to Life with Pastor MDH. I am he. Want to drop a quick word of encouragement in your spirit today, and prayerfully it will spur us on to deeper thought, deeper meditation, deeper counsel with God as we ultimately try to discover our purpose, our plan, and the direction that we have in life. I've been walking through the book of Ecclesiastes. And the book of Ecclesiastes is a very interesting book in that it is really low-hanging fruit. It is very practical in its instruction, very practical in its application. It's not lofty. It's not very spiritual. There are principles within this book that are meant for us to ponder and to meditate on. The book of Ecclesiastes simply, in its most simplest term, is vanity. And what it discovers is the futile emptiness of trying to live life apart from God, trying to exclude God from the deepest parts of our lives and fill that void with a whole lot of stuff. And this is actually written by King Solomon, which is the last of David's sons, and is a heir to the throne of Israel. And he is, by all accounts, the wisest, the richest. He is the most influential king in all of Israel's history. And he is a phenomenal force as it relates to the book of Ecclesiastes. He actually, again, wrote some things in the book of Proverbs as well. But he is a very, very wise man. And he is trying to give us counsel by which experience has afforded him. And contrary to popular belief, everybody, the best teacher in life is not experience. The best teacher in life is wisdom. I don't have to go out and do something to learn of its benefits or its detriment. I can simply look at what that particular action that I'm pondering has done in the life of someone else and gain wisdom, not by going through it, but by looking at what it did through somebody else's life. And so Solomon here is, from a very human perspective, declaring everything to be vanity. So power, popularity, prestige, pleasure. He says nothing that we try to place in this hole that can only be filled by God is ultimately going to bring us the satisfaction that we all desire. To live outside of the will of God is to bring upon yourself heartache and pain. Nothing can fill this God-shaped void that God has reserved for himself in all of our hearts. And so, but once seen by God's perspective, life takes on a whole new meaning in regards to doing good, in regards to living joyfully, living with purpose, fearing God, keeping his commandments, and all of the such. That comes when we find that personal place where God has reserved for himself. And so if you look at Ecclesiastes chapter number 1, verses 1 through 3, it sets the tone and the theme of the entire book. And if they're powerful, powerful words, they're so simple that they're almost too simple. So he says in verse number 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. He says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanities of vanities. All is vanity. And so he says, everything is vanity. And by vanity, he simply means empty. The things that we work for the most, that we try to achieve. And once we get those things in our hands, we realize all of the sweat equity that we put into getting that particular thing is really just empty. And so he says this in verse number 3, and this will carry through the entire 12 chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes. He says this, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? He says, what profit has a man from all of his labor in which he toils under the sun? And so Solomon says here that we are working, and the means by which we're working is to the ends of gaining more things. But after you gain the house, after you gain the car, after you gain the new clothes, the new shoes, the new jewelry, whatever that material possession may be, after you gain it, he says this, what profit does it have? Many of us work 8, 10, 12 hours a day, 5, 6 days a week. We are faithful in what we do. But if you really think about what we do, we are working to the end of the perpetual life cycle of being on this hamster wheel. So we work to pay bills in order to make sure that the mortgage is paid, to make sure that the car note is paid, to make sure that the lights are on and that there's food on the table and that the kids and the family are taken care of. We're working to an end. But Solomon says here, we're spending time, talent, and treasure working for something that ultimately does not equivocate itself in value. Because everything that we are working for, everything that we are trying to attain, all the accolades that we're trying to attain, he says in verse number 3 of chapter number 1 of Ecclesiastes, what profit does it have a man to labor for all of that? He says, because we're toiling for something that ultimately will not fill the place of will not fill the void in which God has reserved for himself. And then he goes on. In verse number 4, he says, one generation passes away and another generation comes. He says, but the earth abides forever. He says, one generation comes, it dies off, and here comes another generation. So we are working, we are toiling, we are trying to do these things to gain a foothold in life, never to understand the goal of life. And the goal of life is for us to have fellowship with God. If God is not the central part of our lives, if we're not revolving our entire life, our work efforts, our family efforts, our marriages, our ministries, if our particular professions in life, if we're not revolving those around the God of the universe, and everything that we're doing outside of that is vanity, it will not account for anything. And here is Solomon, the richest man to ever walk the face of the planet. He was balling out of control. There has never been another man to walk the face of the earth that was richer than Solomon. I'm talking, you put Bill Gates and Warren Buffett together, pool both of their monies together, and then multiply it times 5. They still ain't have enough money. They still don't have the kind of money that Solomon had in his day. If you equate the kind of money that Solomon had in his day and translate that plus inflation to our day, both of those two, which are multi-billionaires, times 5, still will not equate to the type of money that Solomon had. And what Solomon did through this book is he gave us a very introspective look in his life by saying that I've tried everything. I used the wealth that I had. I used the wisdom that I had. I used the prestige that I had. I used the influence that I had, ultimately to reap upon myself pleasures and experiences that I wanted to try to see if it could fill that hole that was only reserved for God. He said, I tried everything. He said, I tried the material possessions, I tried the kingship, I tried authority, I tried partying, I put women there, I put material possessions there, and everything that I put in the place of God ultimately brought me back around to the same place of it all being vanity. You know, once you get the house, you realize that you got to keep the house maintained. Once you get the car, you got to keep the car maintained. Once you get whatever you think you're trying to get, once you put that thing in your hand, you realize that it takes now even more money to maintain it than it did to get it. And so he says everything that we're chasing for in life outside of the plan and the purpose of God is all for nothing. And how many of us have tried to fill that spot in our heart that has only been reserved for God by putting other things in it? So we're chasing materialism. We're chasing the dollar. We're chasing having more, doing more, going this place and going that place, because we're ultimately chasing happiness. And what you don't realize is that happiness is very elusive, right? And so what we need to be chasing instead of happiness is purpose. Here's what he says through all of what he tried to do. Now remember, Solomon was a wise man. He succeeded his father David in the throne, in being on the throne of Israel, and ultimately became catapulted above his father in regards to his kingship in Israel. David collected the materials to build the temple. Solomon actually built the temple. He was wise among his years. God came to him and gave him a blank check to life. He said, Solomon, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Whatever it is, it's a blank check. Here, write it out however you want to see it fit. And in that particular moment, Solomon didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for prestige. What the young Solomon asked for at that time that God gave him a blank check was wisdom. And because he asked for wisdom and did not ask for riches, and because he asked for wisdom and did not ask for authority over his enemy, God gave him not only wisdom, but gave him wealth and riches and prestige. And even so much so that it was more than any other king that had been before him. And so here's ultimately what he says. Through all of these 12 chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes, the highs and the lows, the folly of wisdom, the folly of materialism, the folly of placing things where only God is. In chapter number 12, verse number 13, this is what he says. Let us hear the conclusion of this whole matter. Here's what he said. Here's what he said. I want you to think about what this multi-billionaire said about the goal of life. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is man's all. He says, for God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing and every good or evil. So he said ultimately that the purpose and the plan for man is to fear God and keep his commands. For this is man's all. This is what we were created to do. You're not created to do what you want to do. You were created to do what God purposed you to do. And when you realize the difference between a want and a purpose, you will find the happiness that you've been trying to find for the last 35 years of your life. When you start to walk in your purpose and walk in your destiny, walk in your calling, walk according to God's plan for your life, then you're going to discover true peace, not happiness, but true peace, because peace will keep you through the midst of the storm. Happiness comes and goes. See, when you get true peace, that's a much different thing than being happy. And peace comes with purpose. Okay? Solomon says, through everything that I've experienced throughout all my life, let me just tell you the end goal of it all. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is your all. This is what you're supposed to do. And ultimately, the question that you got to ask yourself is this. Ultimately, you got to ask yourself this. What am I doing? How much time, energy, and effort am I expending on this? What am I doing to replace God in my own heart? And why do I feel the need to replace the God that loves me the way that he says he does? So whatever you're chasing right now, career, money, prestige, materialism, whatever you're chasing, ask yourself the question. When it's all said and done, you're going to look back and look at your life and say, man, I wish I'd have spent more time at the office. Man, I wish I'd have spent more time in school. Or are you going to look at these things that really matter and say, man, I wish I'd have spent more time with my kids. Man, I wish I'd have spent more time in relationship. Man, I wish I'd have spent more time with my wife or with my husband. Are you going to look back over your life and say, man, that was a life that was well lived? Or are you going to look back saying, man, if I had it all over to do again, I wouldn't spend so much time over here. I wouldn't spend so much time doing that. I would chase what really matters. And chasing what really matters is when God fills the void in your heart. And everybody's got that void. Everybody's got that void in their heart that only God can fill. Once God fills that void in your heart, God's going to fill you with purpose, with passion, with direction, with understanding. It all comes along with God. He brings everything with him to fill you and to point you in the way in which he has called for you to go. And so Solomon says, what labor does it have? What does it profit a man to labor the way that he does, if at the end it's all vanity? Make sure you know what you're chasing, and then ask yourself a very real question. Is it worth it?